I'm Missy Bauer with B&M Crop Consulting. We're located in Coldwater, Michigan, and what we're going to talk about today is really the importance of making sure your planter is set up. We have kind of what we call the 10-point planter checklist for setting it up in the shop. So the next month or so here is going to be really important to get your planter in the shop and start running through that checklist to make sure everything's going to be set for when you get ready to head to the field this spring. So in our 10-point checklist, one of the first things on that list is what I call the transmission system. So what we're talking about here is really anything that makes this planter row unit run, as far as from the main seed drive system here, your hex shaft going across, back to the actual meter itself, and making sure that there's no issues. So we're checking bearings and we're checking chains and how these chains roll through the idlers, the sprockets, etc., making sure there's no issues there. A lot of times if you got an issue with the transmission, if there's something wrong with one row, you're going to affect several other rows of that planter. So that's a big thing that we go through in the shop. The next thing on our checklist is making sure your row units are centered. This depends maybe a little bit of where you're at in the country, but a lot of places have rocks or planting on field edges of hills, terraces, etc. can really cause issues with these row units. So we always want to make sure that these row units are staying centered, that they haven't been bent or twisted. So we can check that in the shop pretty easily. The next thing on our checklist is really the down pressure assembly. So there's a lot of different down pressure systems, whether you've got springs, air, or even hydraulic, but you need to make sure overall that there's no problems with the assembly system itself. If it's a spring system, that things are moving like they should, that there's nothing that's potentially broke there. The next thing on the planter is actually the parallel arms. The big thing here is making sure that these bolts and bushings aren't too wore out. So as things get loose, it'll start to wear out, and we'll see that it'll introduce more slop in here. So as you're going across the field, these row units will have a tendency to bounce up and down a lot more. So the first thing we do is just pull one out, inspect it. If it looks like the threads are worn or that bushing's worn, then we know it's time to replace them. If that looks okay, then what we do is just go through and put a guy in a wrench and tighten these all up on every one of the row units. So that's going to be pretty important. The next thing will be on your row unit would be going to row cleaners, whether or not you have row cleaners. If you do, we just want to make sure no bearings are out and things are working properly there. Now, some planters have a no-till Coulter, so if you're in a no-till environment and you're running one of these no-till Coulters, the big key on a no-till Coulter is making sure that it's running shallower in comparison to the bottom of the disc openers. So we usually recommend about a 1/4 inch shallower there. That's so that we don't create what we call potentially a false bottom and variation in planting depth. So we can check that while we're in the shop as well. The next thing on the row unit itself would be the gauge wheels. We have probably one of the biggest problems I see on corn planters today is that these gauge wheels don't stay tight enough. We'd really like these gauge wheels to be running tight up against this disc opener so that there's no space between the inside of the gauge wheel and the disc opener. When there's space in there, we get dry soil, which is on the surface inside the gauge wheel, and as this is moving, that gets dumped back into the seed trench. Causes a lot of problems with our microenvironment. So making sure those are tight is a big part of this as well. So the next thing on our checklist is the opening disc. So we've spun our planter units around here to take a look at this. Big thing with the opening disc is make sure our point of contact is set right, and then also that the diameter of the disc is okay. Most manufacturers only allow for a 1/2 inch of wear on those opening discs. So that's another part that we're going to take a look at. And then the next thing on our list is going to be really your seed tubes, your guards, seed firmers, or on a case planter, your firming point, making sure all of that is intact or that nothing's too wore out and needs to be replaced. It's a pretty common area that if we wear out our guard, that will wear into the seed tube itself, which can cause us a lot of problems. So the last thing on our planter checklist, number 10, is the closing wheels. So one of the important thing on the closing wheels is making sure that they're centered behind the row unit. So those can get off. That's something we need to be doing every year, is checking those. Closing wheels themselves could be probably an entire seminar just on closing wheels. There's a lot of different options of types of wheels to run. The important thing there is realize that your closing wheels need to close the trench, number one, which is the obvious, but number two, that they provide enough firming action around the seed, and that's sometimes the part that gets forgotten about. So kind of wrap this up, we feel that this importance of this checklist, get your planter in the shop, run through this 10-point list and make sure everything is set up kind of from that hitch pin back to the closing wheels. If you haven't been to a planter clinic before, we really recommend that you get to a planter clinic. We'll be hosting one here at B&M Crop Consulting on March 8th. Pre-registration is required for that, and you can look at our website for a link, www.bmcropconsulting.com.